Hello everyone, I'm Linda Hartling. I'm the director of the Human Dignity Humiliation Studies Network, and I'm here with the founding president of the network, Evelin Lindner. She and I are part of a team of individuals who have been working on our course, Human Dignity, Human Rights, and Sustainable Post-Disaster Reconstruction. And I'm very happy to have Evelin here to talk about her chapter that's an important part of the readings for our course. The chapter is entitled Disasters as a Chance to Implement Novel Solutions that Highlight Attention to Human Dignity. And I'm really happy to have you talk directly about this chapter and some of the key points that people in the course can pay attention to.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you for leading this effort, Linda. I'm very, very, very glad. First, I would like to thank and recognize and express my appreciation to Professor Adenrele Awotona for founding the Center for Rebuilding Sustainable Communities After Disasters. And I had the privilege to being invited in 2008 to the first conference, the launching conference, and to write this chapter that you have referred to now. And I start this chapter, it's a conceptual chapter, and it starts with an observation. If we look at reports from disaster management, we see a list of successes. So many bags of rice, so many blankets, so many tents have been distributed. And then 3 years later we hear, people are still, living in, problematic situations. They haven't been helped enough. It's still somehow not really rebuilt. And then we ask ourselves, what has happened? And then I start, for example, by referring to another book by Mary Anderson, Do No Harm, How Aid Can Support Peace or War. So, we have to think very, very deeply through the, definition of success of aid and help. What is success there? How do we define that? So this is part of the beginning of this.
So this is almost a different approach to looking at the dynamics of post-disaster reconstruction. So say more. Keep saying more about that.
Yes. What I try to explain in this chapter is that we live in a world that experiences a transition of normative universes, thought communities. I have lived for many years in parts of the world that are what Rihanna Eisler would call dominator societies, where we find hierarchical structures, like higher beings, so-called higher beings, presiding over so-called lower beings. Apartheid was kind of extreme example, and but still, many parts of the world operate in that way. Women normally are lower beings in these systems. However, we live in a world where we see a trend towards not ranking people into higher and lower beings, but regarding them as equal in dignity, as the first sentence of the first article of the Human Rights Declaration says. Every human being is born free and equal in dignity and rights. So this is a completely new mindset. And aid and humanitarian aid workers are caught in the conflict between these two thought communities or normative universes. And one example would be, for example, that a man says to a humanitarian aid worker, you speak about human rights, but you don't respect my culture. If you're true to your values, you have to respect my culture as being equal to your culture. Okay, then says the humanitarian AIDS worker says, yes, of course I believe in respect and equality. And then the human rights worker will say, but you are treating your wife and your daughter as inferior beings. How can you expect this respect from me when you don't respect your own family? So, and then, how do you get out of this conflict? Or even more palpable, it could be in situations like it was in Congo when the genocidaire, those who had perpetrated the genocide in Rwanda, fled to Congo, and big refugee camps grew there, and basically the conflict was transported to the refugee camp. Like if you were a humanitarian aid worker and you were asked to help a victim who prepares for another genocide, what do you do then? So there are a lot of dilemmas that humanitarian aid workers face. They face also the dilemma that often their superiors, who sit in Washington, for example, have a different take on human rights than they have on the ground. And I have met many people when I made my interviews in Africa for my doctoral research with very, very disillusioned and deeply frustrated humanitarian aid workers who had all read the book by Michael Maron, Road to Hell. How a humanitarian aid worker can be completely eaten up by this clash between these two worlds of values. The humanitarian aid worker would go in with high ideals and would not see how he or she could realize them.
So you're saying that we're in the midst of a major transition, and this has a direct impact on how we engage in humanitarian aid and relationships around the world. And there's gaps between this former normative universe and our existing, what we're headed toward. Plus there are gaps between those who are leading efforts and those who are working on the ground. So I think it's really valuable that you're naming these dilemmas that people will encounter in their work. What would you say is the first step toward heading in a more constructive direction given these dilemmas?
I somehow have a sentence from my book, from my chapter here, highlighted in front of me. Enraged people invoking victimhood and feeling entitled to violate human rights as a remedy may emerge as powerful humiliators of human rights defenders. For example, what would you do in such a situation when you were standing there in a refugee camp somewhere in the world? How do you protect your own integrity? And how do you find a way to act? And there are myriad pathways, I would suggest, just in this situation, this dilemma situation. And then you mentioned all the other dilemma situations that we face. We forgot to mention that there are also very, very strong corporate interests now in humanitarian aid. Humanitarian aid has become a big business. So we have to, look at all these dilemma situations, and each dilemma situation will require a different approach to its management or resolution or improvement. So you're saying just even acknowledging and naming the dilemmas that people are facing as they're trying to work for good in the world is part of the process, but the approach in response to these dilemmas will be different for the particular situation. Yes. Now, perhaps we can end with a quote that I have in my doctoral thesis. What my many of my African interview partners said to me, the intellectuals in Africa told me the following: look, you come here and you say you want to help us, or in my case, I wanted to write a doctoral dissertation, I wanted to do research. You come here, you want to do research. And then you are blind to your own privileges. You drive around here, humanitarian aid workers, you can recognize them, or UN by these white jeeps with walkie-talkies, and I have been part of that. I have been sitting in such jeeps, driving proudly, and all the natives must jump into the ditch just to not being run over by aid vehicles. So the first thing is that aid workers are often not clear about how many privileges they have and how displaying their privileges can have a humiliating effect. And then not to speak of the distortion of economic situations, that then humanitarian aid organizations, they flock in and then they hire everybody, they take the rental space to prices that no local person can afford. So it's a distortion of the situation, the local situation, not to speak of that. And then what my interview partner said, look, we feel that sometimes you use our poverty, our need for help. We would be so glad if we were not needy and not in need of help. You use them for your, to get your salary. You write reports to Washington or wherever your headquarters are, and then you get your salary, a salary you can never dream of, and your local partners don't almost get anything. They are put in the line of danger while you are clear, in a compound. And then you also feel morally elevated. You use our suffering to elevate yourself morally, to feel good about yourself. So the feeling that is left, there is a sour feeling very, very often left in for example, in Africa, where I had my interviews, a sour feeling. In Rwanda, I sit there with a young man who has to care for the children that former helpers fathered, and then they just left and went back to their wives in Europe, in America, and left their children, resourceless in the care of the local population. So there is so much, not to speak of prostitution. We have these cases, in Bosnia.
So the aid workers were involved with leaving this kind of impact.
Yes.
That really disrupted the relationships in the community and left many victims beyond the victims in the first place.
So there are so many aspects of humiliation causing, being part of a disaster, humiliation being caused by disaster, and then even humiliation caused by help. And this last chapter is the most difficult to unmask. Because we are, helpers are proud, and they are right to be proud. I have met so many courageous helpers. They're right to be proud. And then it can sour in so many different ways.
Well, this is what makes this particular course so powerful for me, is helping us rethink how we engage other people in a way that doesn't add humiliation, but really mobilizes energy in partnership with communities to help them through these traumatic and devastating experiences. And I know that's largely about your work, Evelin, as you move around the world. What are some things that you would like people to think about as they go forward in the course?
What is help?
Is the main question.
What happens if the recipient of help says, "Oh, your help humiliates me"? Whose fault is it? It can be the fault of both. There are some recipients of help that simply lack gratitude, and there are some helpers who simply lack the sensitivity to see which help would be helpful. So to think through, what is help? When does help really help?
So that's a huge question, and I hope this is just the start of a longer conversation. We're really happy to have all the people that are joining us for this course, because it is a new way of thinking about and looking at sustainable post-disaster reconstruction that incorporates the ideas of the impact of humiliation and our opposite, which is how to promote the human dignity of all people as we are working to help people move through these experiences. So thank you so much.
This reminds me, by the way, just as a concluding remark, what Professor Awotona said when he first came to our first New York workshop on transforming humiliation and violent conflict. He said that it was revealing, it was a very important insight for him to see that disaster help is only really useful if its aim is dignity and to protect and promote dignity. What other aim should there be if not that aim?
Ah, such an important point. So thank you, Evelin.
Thank you.
Thanks to everyone who is
you.
joining us for the course. We are looking forward to continuing the conversation as the course progresses.
Thank you.